The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. So the first day of our retreat, looking into Great Master Dogen's Shobogenzo, I called it Jewels for the Shobogenzo. It just came up. If the zo in Shobogenzo means treasury or treasure house, and what would have in the treasure house except jewels, things of great value. Each jewel can represent a particular discourse in the Shobogenzo, can represent a particular theme, which is what we're going to look at this week. We're going to look at a few of those themes. And themes is not quite the right word, because they're not ideas, they're not opinions, they're something that we can experience for ourselves. They're real in that sense. Teachings is probably the best word, but that gets a little awkward sometimes to keep saying that. It sometimes feel like gilding the lily. So as we take these jewels out of the treasure house, as with real jewels, we need to shine the light of meditation on them. Meditation is what enables us to see them, appreciate their beauty, the many different facets, all the things that go into making a jewel beautiful. Without that light, it's just a hunk of stone in the dark, of no particular value or beauty. I want to start with an ending. I want to look at the end of the scripture of Avalokiteshvara, the scripture of Kanzeon Bodhisattva, of great compassion. This is a scripture that's done every day in the monastery. We used to do it, I think, here before my time as part of morning service. Some temples still do that. Here it's done by a couple of monks who get up early and do the scripture in the Avalokiteshvara shrine, asking for help for the day and for raising the seed of compassion. I'm starting with this ending because it covers many of the themes, jewels, that we're going to look at this week. So we'll do that, and then I want to talk some about the Shobogenzo, some about Dogen, and then we'll begin to explore Doshin. The scripture of Avalokiteshvara ends. When the Buddha finished the recitation in the hall of this great scripture, which makes clearly plain the life and work of the all-sided one, all people present then, a great concourse, in number 480,000 strong, cherished within their hearts a longing deep for the supreme enlightenment with which nothing in all the world compares. As I mentioned to our retreat guest last night, and I think the monks probably know this, Dogen was particularly fond of the Lotus Sutra, Lotus Scripture. There's one translation which even has an appendix in which they trace all the times in the Shobogenzo that Dogen quotes the Lotus Sutra. The scripture Avalokiteshvara is a chapter from the Lotus Sutra, or scripture. So looking at this ending verse, the first thing the last thing we note is that there's something here with which nothing can compare. Nothing in the universe can compare. That's our aspiration. We want to be willing to look beyond our ordinary day and our ordinary life and appreciate that there's value in meditation, Buddhist practice, that can't be seen with the ordinary eye. The fact that you are all here indicates you've already stepped onto that path, at least opening your heart to that possibility. What we're talking about is not separate from daily life. And this is one of the points Dogen makes again and again, and we'll get to that near the end of the retreat. The longing deep within our hearts is the bodhicitta. Bodhi means enlightenment, citta means mind. This is Doshin, the mind that seeks enlightenment, the mind that seeks to be awakened, the Buddha-seeking mind. That's our true heart. That's our true self. That's what we all long to reunite with. That's not quite right because we already have it. And in one sense, we're not separate from it. But our karma manifesting as greed, hate, and delusion obscures that. And the purpose of Buddhist training is to remove those clouds so that we can see the true, the real. But we just don't cast off the clouds to the netherworlds. From clouds come rain. So our load of karma that we have, as we convert it, it produces rain. It produces the thing, water, that all living things on the earth require. There's another important point there in that the scripture says, cherish a longing deep. This is something that we want to generate a willingness to keep doing it. It's a practice. We have to continue to cherish the value of our practice, cherish the value of meditation. And we do that primarily through the precepts. Meditation is the foundation, but as Reverend Master Jisho said last night, the precepts are the best way to know how to be a Buddha. We start out by being like a Buddha, and then we become Buddha. We're actually Buddha in the beginning to start with, but we don't realize it. We have to train to realize that. Another part of that scripture ending talks about supreme enlightenment. This is referring to the enlightenment that includes all things, all beings, sometimes called fully perfected enlightenment. It's sometimes used in contrast to personal liberation. Rather than just seeking our own liberation, we want the liberation of all beings. This is sometimes called Mahayana, the great vehicle. We'll talk about that and how Dogen looks at that and what he thinks of that term, what he means by that term, how that's rooted in the Lotus Sutra. And the last thing that's important in that is that 84,000 people, 84,000 things, 84,000 is a Buddhist number that means infinite, just uncountable. And in our quest, in our efforts to realize the Buddha's teaching, we want all beings, all things to share in this. This is expressed perhaps most clearly in the Tenkoroku by Great Master Keizan, the opening chapter on Shakyamuni, where he says, I was, am, and will be enlightened with the universe. We are not separate. Our training helps all things, helps all beings. And the more we can focus on making our life a venue for training, the more other beings benefit. It's a big task we've set out for ourselves. And that's, again, part of the Bodhisattva vow, which we'll talk about, the intention to seek enlightenment for the benefit of all. Okay, Shobogenzo. Shobo translates as true teachings. Okay? Sometimes translated as true law. Law was sort of an old-fashioned word for describing truth, teachings, the Dharma. Dogen will make a very important point, and again, is that what he's teaching is what's called the right law. A helpful translation is authentic Dharma. That's what one translator uses, authentic. The Chinese character for this show, it means right, it means true, it means appropriate, it means authentic, it means genuine. It's not a true in opposition to false, but it's true that's pointing beyond any set of opposites. One of the conventions we use in many of our orders' writings is putting this true in capital letters. And then you start looking, though, many things are capitalized. That's because when you see something capitalized, it's pointing beyond. It's pointing beyond our ordinary point of view. It's pointing to the authentic Dharma. And Dogen is quite precise about what he means by authentic Dharma. The criterion for good practice, according to Dogen, is how valuable it is. Is it working? He was not a theologian or a philosopher. He probably, if he were buried rather than cremated, he'd probably turn over in his grave to be called a thinker. Because he's trying to point us beyond the discriminatory mind, beyond any set of opposites. someone, I can't remember who, asked some great master about what's the essence of Dogen's teaching, and the monk replied, practice, practice, practice. Okay. It's the practice that makes our understanding authentic. Not a set of beliefs, not doctrines, ideas, ideals. It's our practice, it's our training. And that's not apart from daily life. And this is one of the points Dogen, again, will make again and again, and which he is well known for. We translate it and talk about it sometimes as training and enlightenment are one. So what is the authentically transmitted Buddha Dharma? Here's a quote from another discourse in the Shobogenzo called Butsudo, On the Buddha's Way. Butsu, of course, is Buddha. Do is way. That's the same word that can be translated as the path, or again, the truth. It's the Tao that comes out of the Chinese language. So Dogen says, so if you wish to receive the authentic transmission of the conduct of the way, you must not look for or hearken to sectarian names. That which Buddha after Buddha and ancestor after ancestor has received and authentically transmitted is the unsurpassed wisdom of the treasure house of the eye of the true teachings. The Dharma that is possessed by the Buddhas and ancestors has been wholly transmitted by the Buddhas and ancestors, and there is nothing new to be added to the Dharma. This principle is the very bones of the Dharma and the very marrow of the way. Okay, hold that in mind. We'll come back to that. One of Dogen's primary points, and this comes directly out of the Lotus Sutra, is that there is just one Dharma. Dogen said there is no such thing as a Zen sect. He didn't like the classification of Zen in China into 5 houses. This discourse on Butsudo is a whole discourse, kind of explaining why this is not so. Why what we practice is the Dharma. And in contrast to some of the other religious leaders of his day, he didn't believe that these were the end times in Japan and that people couldn't practice like the Buddha did and realize what the Buddha had realized. In that sense, you could say, he was old-fashioned, I suppose. Or you could see him as a reformer. He was trying to get back to the original Buddha Dharma. Yes, adapted for Japan in the 13th century. But he points us back again and again, not to get caught by names and this idea of sects and ins and outs and true and false and so forth. We just be still and know the true Dharma. Dogen is traditionally considered to be very difficult. Very difficult to read. Very difficult to understand. There's some truth in that. But many of his writings are just very straightforward. He has a whole writing on the instructions to the chief cook that most of you probably are familiar with, in which he just outlines, this is how you cook. But he has a spiritual component to it. He has all sorts of, there's guidelines for having a formal meditation meal. There's guidelines for how to live in the meditation hall. Any number of other writings that are pretty straightforward. There's several things that make Dogen difficult. One is that he was writing in medieval Japanese. The Shobogenzo has to be, it's not exactly a translation, but has to be completely reworked so that contemporary Japanese can read it. Dogen was very well educated, and he was a precocious child, as we would call him, these days. He was well read in the Confucian classics. He studied them as a child. He read the whole Chinese Tripitaka, which is, 100 volumes, the Buddhist teachings. He was a poet, had a very sensitive aesthetic component. Once he started practicing, he practiced in Tendai Buddhism. It was the generic Buddhism of his day. He got the best that he could, found it unsatisfactory, and his teachers very wisely sent him to someone else. They could see they had something that wasn't being satisfied. So he went and studied Rinzai Zen for 7 years, koan practice. So by the time he starts writing the Shobogenzo, he has this huge background of reference material, and he keeps referring to things again and again in the Shobogenzo that the people listening would understand. There's references to, great Chinese masters. There's references to Nagarjuna, an Indian master in our line. He quotes Confucius. He quotes all sorts of things. And the people he was teaching would understand because they had a similar education, similar background. What I find the real blessings of Reverend Master Hubert's translation is that he points to the meaning of what Dogen was teaching. There are different ways to translate. There are different translations of the Shobogenzo. Each has its value. There are some that are what's turned out to be almost kind of a reference book on the Shobogenzo that the Japanese Soto Zen Church sponsored. It's not readable. It's not. This is one of the translators involved said, this is just not readable to practice. This is really not of any use to practice. But it's useful for reference to begin, to get some of the shadings and color and tones that Dogen uses, to understand some of his references. Most, if not all, of the references that Reverend Master Hubert provides are related to training and related to practice. He subtitled his translation a trainee's translation. This is the translator of someone who's practicing. This way of translating, of going for the meaning, can be traced back to Kumarajiva. He was the great, I think he was born in Central Asia, went to China. He translated the Lotus Sutra. There were other translations, but none were as good as his. He was the first one to what they call the New Translation School, who started just presenting Buddhism as Buddhism rather than in Taoist terminology that people would understand. The Buddhists had come out far enough along that they could get understand the concepts without referring them back to Taoism. Reverend Master Ji did a similar thing in her early teaching. She would also often talk about Christianity or other, Jewish beliefs or understandings or practices. But at one point she put all that down. Before, as Westerners, she had to speak a language that we could understand. And at some point she put it all down and says, now I can teach Buddhism as Buddhism. And there's a real shift in the way she teaches and how she presents things. And a lot of the references in the early writings they're just no longer necessary. The Buddhist, her community, the Buddhist Sangha in general, had come far enough along that they could understand Buddhism as it was in itself, without a constant referring to another belief system, way of looking at things. And this is how Reverend Master Jiyu herself translated. This is the way that her teacher, her master in Japan, taught her to translate. When she was going through the Shobogenzo with us, and she covered the whole thing in her lifetime. Very interesting. The very last chapter of the Shobogenzo was on the teachings of the Buddha at death, and that was her last lecture. It's the last lecture that Dogen wrote. It's the last lecture that she talked about. So she covered the whole thing in the course of her 27 odd years here at Shasta Abbey. She didn't, and when she would talk about the Shobogenzo, a discourse, she didn't do a line-by-line commentary. She put her mind where Dogen's mind was or had been, and then speak from her own experience. She knew what Dogen was talking about, and so she could explain it in her own words, in her own experience, in a language that we could understand. Sometimes she would, lecture on a discourse for a couple of days, and he said, well, you folks can work out the rest for yourself. She had that kind of confidence in her disciples. An interesting thing to do sometime, if you want, is go through Reverend Master Hubert's translation and just read the footnotes. It's an education in itself. Or just read the introduction to each discourse. You can, although knowledge is not the end, you can gain a lot of background information about the language to talk about, what he's, Dogen's describing, how things translate into English. As I said, it's just for a cold winter night. It makes really profound reading. So one of the things that makes Dogen difficult in terms of these references, Reverend Master Hubert, for our benefit, has narrowed the references down to the things that really affect the meaning of what Dogen is talking about. He also put it into readable English. Some of the early translation of the Shobogenzo, Reverend Master Jiyu would work from. She would have to kind of retranslate. She would read the translation for the book from Japanese. He said, I just have to retranslate that. So she would retranslate because it wasn't quite right on, for English-speaking people. The other thing that makes Dogen difficult is that he's playing with words. He's playing with language. He's turning things inside out. He's trying to push people beyond their ordinary understanding. He does it in all sorts of ways, with puns, all sorts of things. They just don't come across in English. He also was using a code that was used by primarily Zen masters. Buddhism was not always a safe religion to practice in China, so they developed this code to talk about things without risk being, executed. Some of the ancestors were. An example is from Sandokai is, the retainer serves his lord, the emperor, the father does, his child obey. That sounds like very good instructions for a child growing up in a Confucian society. You obey the emperor, you obey your father, filial piety. And so the scripture looks like, oh yes, well this is very sound. But that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about the master-disciple relationship. The disciple listens to the master, tries to put it into practice, has great respect and reverence for the teacher. And then it goes on another level. I'm kind of running on too long here. It's about listening to our own heart. Listening to the still small voice. Listening to that which nudges us when we're about to break a precept often. If we just stop for just a minute, just a moment. So all these things combine to make Dogen difficult. But let me read you something that a translator of the Shobogenzo into Japanese in the mid-20th century now. He talks about his own difficulties, but also his own method. He'd say, you're unlikely to understand something without personal experience. This was particularly so with the Shobogenzo. Since then, however, no matter how difficult each word and sentence may be, I am able to study it with courage and an expectation of understanding it at some time in the future. He also described the Shobogenzo as the warm skin and flesh of Dogen. He says, it is a record of his bodily, corporeal, this life activity. The Shobogenzo is living thought. It's to go beyond simple words. The traditional instruction for the Shobogenzo is one should not be concerned with words themselves, but should look rather at the passages by opening one's intuitive faculty, literally, eyes of the path. In Shobogenzo, the Gan is eye. It's the treasure house of the eye of the true teaching. This is what I call reading with the heart. Basically try to read it with meditation, repeated readings deepen your understanding. And don't read it for information. Read it as a meditative experience. Your understanding grows over time. This translator writes, though difficult, by reading the text repeatedly, one may gradually open one's eyes of truth, incrementally, by increasing the degree of understanding obtained with the effort of each reading, even becoming able to read the living thought behind the form of the expression. In short, one becomes the Shobogenzo. Then for the first time, one is truly able to read the text as it is. Oneself becoming the Shobogenzo means playing with the text, with one's entire soul and spirit, penetrating into the passages so deeply as to lose the duality between oneself and the Shobogenzo. So we try to read it with an open heart. We don't worry if we don't understand it completely at the moment. Trust that it goes in somewhere. It's recorded somewhere. And when we need to understand it, it will arise. In repeated readings, you'll gain in your understanding. The other thing I'll just end with Dogen, about Dogen, is that we may not be able to understand the Shobogenzo in the way it was presented to his disciples, if you will, in the language. But we can match those disciples' hearts. We can long for the Dharma in the same way that they did. We can be an open vessel to hear the teaching and understand it. It's not beyond our capacity. Okay, let's stop for a little while and do some walking meditation, and then we'll come back and begin to look at Doshin. So now looking at Doshin, the discourse itself, the jewel, the treasure house. Doshin, I think Reverend Hubert translated it something as on the mind's search for truth. This is the bodhicitta. This is the Buddha-seeking mind. This is the expression of the fifth law of the universe. Those of you who are familiar with that set of teachings on what makes our universe the way it is. It starts off with the physical laws, and there's biological laws, and there's karma. And the fifth one is all beings have an intuitive understanding of the Buddha nature. And no one's left out. One of the reasons the Lotus Sutra was particularly popular and influential was that it made this very clear. We'll talk more about that later, but one of the main points in the Lotus Sutra is that we're all going to reach Buddhahood. There are the separate paths are just provisional means. They're skillful means. They're a way of getting people to train. And we're all going to realize full enlightenment. Everyone. Even what were called the Shravakas. Dogen uses this term, Shravakas and Vacheka Buddhas. He's not talking about contemporary Theravadan practice. That didn't even exist in his day. He's talking about a narrow-minded view of practice. Narrow-minded in the view of, this is for myself. The ideal is often described as the Arahant. In contrast to that, Mahayana, the great vehicle, put forth the ideal of the Bodhisattva. Bodhi means enlightenment, Sattva means being. Mahayana was a movement in Buddhism around the first century of the Christian or common era. We don't know where it came from. It just all of a sudden, in the historical and archaeological records, it's just there. We can only find, what we find are like scriptures, but they'd been around a couple of hundred years because everyone already knew about them. Anyway, there was a movement, and part of the movement was a placement, emphasis on compassion. Not to the exclusion of wisdom, but including both compassion and wisdom. And I'll talk about that a bit more later in the week. But the Lotus Sutra said everyone was predicted for Buddhahood. Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, it's a chapter in which Devadatta is predicted for Buddhahood. For Buddhas was almost the embodiment of evil because it's the Buddha's cousin who was always trying to take over the order, hurt the Buddha, kill the Buddha. The Buddha said, oh yes, you'll become a Buddha in the future. And then Buddhahood is predicted for women. The dragon princess's daughter. She dances circles around Shariputra, who's the representative of the old wisdom. Everyone has the Buddha nature. Everyone is on the path. Everyone will eventually reach Buddhahood. Now, this may take a while. One of my favorite cartoons is there's a young novice kind of standing at the trailhead of the spiritual path, and the old monk and you can see the path going way off into the distance, into the mountains, and the old monk is advising him. He says, it's a long trip, you better pack a lunch. And so we have to be patient, determined, yet patient. And out of this emphasis, our compassion becomes so great that we're willing to be reborn again and again and again, however long it takes to enable all beings to realize enlightenment. One of the things that does, and it shifts the focus to right now is okay. Right now is our great opportunity. Right now we can train. What we do right now matters. There's the lovely quote that the Dalai Lama recites sometimes about as long as beings exist, as long as karma exists, as long as space exists, so will I too also exist. There's the willingness in the Bodhisattva vow just to practice selflessly. When we talk about this principle, the way it's expressed in our tradition often is by the phrase endless training. This is what endless training means. Training doesn't end. There are chapters in the Shobogenzo that Master Jiyu comments on, and Roar of the Tigers too. There's practice after Buddhahood. There's a number of chapters that describe practicing after we realize Buddhahood. The commitment is completely open-ended. The commitment is solid. It's not the right word, solid, but it's complete. And so in what I will call Mahayana Buddhism, which we'll talk about later, emphasis is on practicing the perfections, or called the perfections. Paramitas is the original word. It basically means crossing over. They are the qualities that we practice in order to cross ourselves, but also to cross others to the other shore. There's precepts, there's giving, there's patience, determination, meditation, wisdom. And we can practice all of those right now. Okay. And the focus in training becomes on training right now. And again, this comes out of Dogen. We'll talk about it more toward the end of the week when we talk about every minute meditation and what I call living Buddha nature. We don't have to wait for a better rebirth to be born as a monk. for instance, as some Buddhist traditions would hold up, at that time at least, would hold up as the great aim. We don't have to be born into a Pure Land. We can go straight into enlightenment and train and continue to help others. In our tradition, when we talk about Pure Land, it's a synonym for nirvana. And Dogen himself is the root of this. He says, the Pure Land is my mind. The Pure Land is here. Let us actualize the Pure Land that is already here. Can we act as if this is the Pure Land and treat other people as Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in a Pure Land? One of the ways of looking at ceremonial is that it's an effort to recreate is not quite the right word, but to create circumstances that have the qualities of a Pure Land. And we have the opportunity to act in that way through bowing, expressing gratitude, being still, offering. There's a lot of pieces to it, but it's so that we can then take those attitudes, take those qualities into daily life. And that's a Pure Land too. Again, this is a significant contribution that Dogen makes to really the history of Buddhism. It was there all along in the Chinese Chan monks, but it was Dogen who kind of put it into on the front page, at least for those of us who come out of a Japanese tradition. Doshin. Do means way, means Tao, as we talked about. It's also the path. It's what we do. It's not just what we aim for, but it's what we do. We walk the path. Translates as Dharma. Shen means heart. It's also translated as mind, but mind with a capital M. It's the mind that's, the word mind is pointing to something beyond the gray matter in our brain. It's pointing to something beyond intellectual mind. Sometimes it's translated as heart mind. In Eastern languages, they use the same character, Shen, for both mind and heart. So it's hard to figure out which one are they referring to. And part of the usefulness of a good translation is that it can point to when the gray matter, or mind, or discriminative mind, is being referred to, and when the heart mind is being referred to. The word Shen is the source of our ship and three drum symbol we use for our particular lineage. It's a ship. It's moving. This is the great vehicle. As I said last night, we've begun a voyage. Actually, we're already on a voyage. Three drums represent the three treasures, or compassion, love, and wisdom. It's about moving. So we've put Do and Shin together. What do you get? You get the way of practice of the heart in meditation. The ideal of the Bodhisattva evolved in part because the emphasis became on what the Buddha did after his enlightenment rather than what he did before. Leading up to his enlightenment, he spent 6-7 years. After his enlightenment, he spent 40 years just helping people. ceaseless practice, endless training, continual love, continual giving. And it wasn't easy. He had some monks who were always trying to push the envelope on the Vinaya, the monastic rules. He had his cousin who was trying to take over the order. He was ambitious. And the Buddha wasn't popular in his day. There were many people who were attracted to his teaching, but he was throwing the caste system completely out the window. He allowed women to ordain. This was just unheard of. We see Dogen doing the same thing in Japan 1,200 years later. He has one discourse on bowing will gain you the very marrow of the way, which he talks about bowing to women teachers. He says, if they are practicing the Dharma, bow to them. Do not be concerned with the external appearance. He really almost kind of starts railing about this, and has even a subsequent follow-up discourse. It appears that disciples weren't getting it. And fortunately, today we live at a time when women can train. This is something new. Or at least it's been a long time. Go Zenji, Reverend Master Jiu's master in Japan, would say, religion is easy to change, custom is hard to change. Like many other religions, Buddhism didn't recognize the equality of women, even though the founding teachers would say so. They didn't put it into practice. Custom is hard to change. And we're so fortunate now to live at a time when our custom is different, and we can practice what the Buddha actually taught. We can practice what Dogen taught. Doshin, the way-seeking mind. Dogen had several other discourses in the Shobogenzo on this topic, so we'll just have to touch on it today and this week. In one of these other discourses, he says, Bodai Shen, or Doshin. He calls it different things depending on the circumstances. Doshin, Bodai Shen, is the vow of resolution committed to upholding midstream till all other beings have been rescued, crossing in safety to the other shore. We care about others as well as ourselves. Dogen says on the Mind Search for Truth, Doshin, in our pursuit of the Buddha's way, first off, we should consider our mind's search for truth to be foremost. Those who know what the mind's search for truth really is are rare indeed. So we need to inquire what it is from people who clearly know. Even though people in general are said to have a mind that is searching for the truth, there are those people who truly do not have a searching mind. And there are some people who truly have a searching mind, though it is unrecognized by others. Thus it is difficult to know who has and does not have such a mind. For the most part, we do not listen to what foolish or wicked people say. Much less do we trust them. And we should not treat our own mind as foremost, but consider only what the Buddha expressed to be foremost. Constantly, day and night, we should hold in our mind the search for truth, desiring and praying to realize what true wisdom is in this world of ours. The mind's search for truth. The fact that we're all here means we've awakened it. The mind's search for truth seems to have two movements, if you will. The first movement is a recognition of dukkha, suffering. On some level, we're discontent. Some level, we're dissatisfied. Something in us knows that our current situation is not the opportunity we would wish it to be. We have the Buddha, after being sheltered in the palace for 39 years or however long it was, 29, he came in contact with old age, someone who was really, really old, someone who was sick, probably a really awful disease like leprosy, someone who died, a corpse. All of this generated dukkha in him. He didn't have the answer to this, and it was bugging him. It was awful. It became an obsession that he had to find an answer to this, not only for himself, but for his family, his clan, other beings. And then he saw a monk. Remember, this was the first time he had ever seen it. What at the time was a wandering mendicant. History had a long tradition of wandering monks. The Buddha, in founding his order, was just continuing what was a quite common way of organizing people to realize the truth. You have a teacher, you have people who study with them, and they wander. That's what the Buddha did. He wandered from place to place. So the Buddha saw a monk. He saw something that was the second turning in the mind search for the way. He saw what it is, or a sense of something else, something other. Dogen had a similar experience. We don't know who his father was. In one sense, he was illegitimate. His mother died when he was 7 years old. It said that his first awakening to the Buddha-seeking mind was seeing the smoke rise from her corpse at her death, at her cremation. We'll look at the film at the end of the week in Zen, and I can't remember whether this is historical or not, but his mother asks him on her deathbed to go in search of the truth. So a seed was planted that there was something else to look for, to gain. Many of us grew up in the 60s, and we were discontent with just about everything. Politics, government, religion, sexual stereotypes, come on and on. It was this great dissatisfaction. And many of us turn to Eastern religion as a way of responding to that and moving in a positive direction, of awakening the Buddha-seeking mind. Seeing, being inspired to awaken the Buddha-seeking mind, it doesn't have to be seeing a monk. It means seeing some act of compassion, some act of generosity, some act of kindness, something that gives us hope, something that turns us within, turns us seeking, looking. There must be something more. We know in our hearts there is something more, but where can I find it? And sometimes that search takes a long time before we connect with a teacher, a partner, another person that we can practice with. But we have to do. People are different. So some people, it takes them a long time to find the path, but they're actually already on the path, even though they haven't consciously stepped onto it. And when we see that other possibility, and it seems in our heart, this is the way to go. This responds to my own intuitive sense of what is right, what is good. And I want to learn about that in more depth. Eventually we want to make our whole lives the expression of that. So something awakens the Buddha-seeking mind in us. Something embodies that fifth law of the universe, that intuitive nature of all beings have an intuitive nature, all beings have an intuitive knowledge of the Buddha nature. And the fact that all beings have that means that, it includes your neighbor that you don't get along with. It includes, for us, we can, Muslim terrorists, people that we can, some in our society feel they're the most evil people to ever live, or at least in the 21st century. For Reverend Master Jiu in Japan, it was Hitler. She had to see that Hitler too had the Buddha nature. This was a big stretch for her. She had her homeland, her family, her friends, her life had just been completely destroyed by Hitler in World War II. So she gets to Japan and they tell her that she has to see Hitler as Buddha, and it's just, she's kind of boggles her mind. And so as we're trying, this is where the compassion comes into it, because we're all walking this together. We all have this intuitive knowledge. So the compassion is extended to those who haven't awakened that knowledge, because within them it is there too. And who knows, maybe your being kind to some person will awaken this Buddha-seeking mind in them. We never know who we affect, who we influence. The Buddha-seeking mind is not something specific to Buddhism. This is how our faith tradition looks at it. I remember a 60 Minutes program some years ago about a young white American woman who traveled to South Africa and lived in the worst apartheid ghettos, attending to the needs of people there. Her name was Amy Beale. She organized help. She did anything she could to lessen the enormous amount of suffering that surrounded her. She wasn't of any particular religion. She simply responded to a need and answered it as she was able. It was very dangerous. People would tell her that her life was at risk. This was really seen to be stupid, what she was doing. And they were right. She eventually was murdered senselessly by, I think there were two black men. Of course, everyone grieved so much. And in the native African religion, she was viewed as, a bodhisattva or a saint. They have a word in the one of the South African native languages that describes this quality. It embodies the highest achievement of someone in their world. It's Ubuntu. What it means is essence of humanity. It's our true nature. It includes warmth, generosity, hospitality, compassion, patience. This sounds like being a bodhisattva. Exactly. This isn't a Buddhist. We don't have the market on this. We haven't cornered the market on this. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there, as it is the case with many profound people. After her death, her parents, who lived in Southern California, went to South Africa to figure out what was their daughter doing. A, that she was killed, and B, that all these people held her in such high regard. They were just overwhelmed by this. And and inspired by her efforts and not wanting her work to be in vain, they began spending part of each year in the ghettos continuing her work. And even the murderers eventually came around as well, because they had recognized the harm they had done. They asked for forgiveness, received forgiveness from the parents, and they turned their lives around. The diagrams you have in your booklet were a reproduction of some drawings that we developed at the Eugene Priory, where I was the temple monk, and we were doing a Dharma talk on Doshin. They developed without a plan. They didn't have something in mind. They just happened as we talked. So what you have is the completed diagrams, but I think they can still illustrate what Dogen was talking about. They're all intimately connected with meditation, the practice of meditation. There's one called Buddha Nature Permeating All. That was an attempt to show basically a human being, what we call a self. The brightness, the light, that's just the Buddha nature. And there's these lines around it, but they're like a permeable membrane. We learned that in 10th grade biology. The Buddha nature isn't hindered by anything. And we made the lines dotted or broken to indicate that the Buddha nature is going through those. And not just between the cracks between them, but through them, all of them. The Buddha nature permeates everything. And at the heart is, what is it? Meditation. Meditation is the Buddha mind. Meditation is the Buddha nature. So that first circle represents meditation. Okay? So we look, well, what else do we practice with? The next step out is the precepts. And then there's a third circle. Yes, we meditate formally, like we're doing here. We work on keeping the precepts. But then there's another circle, and that's our daily life. It's just an attempt to show how our practice accords with reality, but also inspires us to live in real accord with that reality. We're not separate. It's what's often called interdependence or interconnectedness. The first diagram that I just described is looking down on the fountain from above. It's a three-tiered fountain. You turn and look at it from the side, and it's a fountain. Water's flowing through that. What is that water? What is it that flows through us? That water is the Doshin. That water is the Buddha-seeking mind. And we're the pump. It's our willingness to train that keeps that water flowing constantly. I guess sometimes we get tired and we don't take very good care of the pump. We don't take very good care of the fountain. But we can always restore it and begin again. Moment by moment we begin again. In our meditation tradition, we don't worry too much about the future. We try to be right here now. And because we know that what we do right now determines the course of the future. Right now is when we can actually do something, that we can affect our life, our future lives, the lives of other people. It's right here is where we put the focus of the practice. Not in a future heaven, a future state. It's right here. This is where we can this is where we have choices. This is where karma is created, for good or for ill. In the second diagram, I hope you can see, there's a person drawn kind of can't remember the right word, but it's not imposed, but overprinted the fountain. Again, it is to show that what this fountain is our, working from the bottom up, is our body, speech, and mind. The mind is at the top, is the source, it's the meditation. It flows down, manifests itself through the precepts by how we act. And as we know, the way the mind works, usually we start with mental karma, and then it becomes verbal. We somehow express it in our mind sometimes we end up speaking it. Okay? And then the third level is the body. What are we actually doing? And the fountain flows through all of those. And it's what's going on within us in meditation. And what's important is to keep this flowing. This is what Dogen is referring to in another discourse called Uji, existence, time, flow. It's not a philosophical discourse of the meaning of time. It's an attempt to describe the Buddha nature. It exists. It exists everywhere. Existence, time. There is no time when it does not exist, or will not exist, or has not existed. Okay? How can this be? Well, the third of those is flow. Existence, time, flow. This is not flow, kind of the casual, just go with the flow. This is flow with a capital F. Go with the promptings of heart. Listen to that. And go with that. Keep the fountain flowing. It all depends upon us. It all depends upon us moment by moment. Coming back to Dogen, he continues. In these degenerate days of the Dharma, those who genuinely have a mind that searches for the truth are not many. Even so, please keep impermanence in mind, and do not forget that the world is transient and human life is uncertain. And we need not consciously keep in mind the notion that I am thinking about the transience of the world. Just give emphasis to the Dharma and do not take my body or my life too seriously. And for the sake of the Dharma, do not be resentful towards your body or your life. He's pointing us, be grateful for your opportunity. Be grateful to be alive. Be grateful to have encountered the Dharma. This is quite rare. Impermanence is a fact. We don't have to impose it on reality. If we're still and really look, we can see it. And then there comes a moment where we really see it. Just by doing your meditation, you develop the faculty of seeing that. And part of the challenge of training is to see that in form of meditation. Then remember that, when you get out and are raking the yard, or shopping in the grocery store. Usually, part of the challenge of being a human being is that we don't want things to be permanent. We don't want things to be impermanent. This is attachment. It goes back to something in the human consciousness, the first beginnings of human civilization, evolution. There's the cave man or the cave woman. And most things are divided up into two choices. There's things that contribute to my survival and things that don't. What do I need to do? Well, I need to go hunt for animals to feed the family. That becomes good. Something that threatens the family becomes a bear. Oh, that's bad. That's threatening. And so the good and bad is based, it starts out as something useful. But we get more and more sophisticated and we label things as good and bad that actually aren't based in reality, but just in our own experience, our karmic experience. And we're all the result of who knows how many lives, how many moments. We don't have to insist on understanding rebirth in order to practice. We're being reborn every moment. I was talking with one of our visiting monks about rebirth, and he had said that his teacher has encouraged people not to think of it as rebirth, but as new birth. We're constantly being born again. And the teachings say, we'll look at this into the, death, it becomes just a point in time. The continuum of our consciousness continues. And death is just another door. I haven't been through that door myself, at least not recently. But we'll look at what Doshin says about that. So we're the sum total of all of our experience. And somewhere along the way, something gets saddened. Reverend Master Ji called it slightly saddened love. We get hurt, essentially, in some way. And out of that hurt, we move away from our Buddha nature. And then that becomes a habit. And pretty soon here we are, many moments down the road, and we can be very deluded. We've lost touch with the Buddha nature. We've lost touch with the flow. We've lost touch with the precepts. We've lost touch with compassion. And training is reorienting to that. Whether it's formal, in doing jukai, as many of you have, taking the precepts. Informally, you just, where you are at the moment. You're not ready to do it formally, but you certainly want to do this in daily life. We awaken the Buddha-seeking mind. And as I started out, we have to cherish this. We want to cherish this. If we want to continue our practice, if we want to know what the Buddha knew, realize what all the Buddhas and ancestors have come to know for themselves with certainty, we have to cherish that wish. We have to cherish that willingness to keep the fountain flowing. Somewhere the Buddha said there's 4 things that rarely come to maturity. I hunted for the source of this, but I just couldn't find it. But the 4 things, one of them was fish eggs. A fish lays thousands of eggs with the mind, to the extent that a fish can be mindful, that some of them will germinate. Some of them will become the next generation of fish. The Buddha gives a couple other examples, which I can't remember. But then he also said the bodhicitta, the Buddha-seeking mind. We have to keep nourishing it. It's like every one of those little fish eggs. Each one is the Buddha nature. Each one is an opportunity to look within. Each moment is the opportunity to be still. It takes, to be honest, it takes a lot of hard work. Our Master Mayan uses the phrase, I don't know whether it's original with her, but it's certainly become part of our way of talking about things, is that simple but not easy. It's simple in the sense of you just sit down, you circulate the breath, you sit still. That's very simple. You've all had meditation instruction. You've all been given the initiation. You've all been given the empowerment. You have everything that we can offer. You have all the secrets. And it's up to you to keep that going. And that's where the difficulty is. Moment to moment, day to day, month after month, year after year, without any expectation. One of the things that our particular form of meditation is described as sometimes as post-enlightenment meditation. We're all already enlightened. We are all already have the Buddha nature. And we have to act on it, to manifest it, to realize it, to actualize it. And so in this place of post-enlightenment, there's nothing to gain. We already have it. It undermines our attachment to the self. It undermines our attachment to wanting things or being averse to things. We already have the Buddha nature. We have the precepts, wonderful guide. Can we keep the fountain flowing through those? Can we keep it active, moment by moment by moment? Simple but not easy. At least for me, that's part of the great value of the Sangha. It's not the whole value of the Sangha. is our helping each other do this. Ananda once said to the Buddha, Ananda was his chief assistant, oh Buddha, half the holy life is living with the Sangha, is living with those who practice. And the Buddha said, no, Ananda. Living with others is the whole of the holy life. Cherish our opportunities to be together. Cherish our opportunities of communicating with each other. Even if you live far away, stay in touch. Study the Dharma with internet now. There's hardly any boundaries to where you can go. Keep the fountain flowing. I'm going to stop there for the day, and it's close to lunchtime, so there'll be a few minutes between now and lunch. You can help with the kitchen. You can just take a break. Tomorrow we'll look at the 3 refuges. And again, think of this 3-tiered fountain. I'm going to give the secrets of the talk away. It's Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Look at the diagrams in the book of the different ways that this 3-tiered fountain express the teaching. It's a good memory aid. So why don't we close with 3 closing homages. Homage to all of the Buddhas in all worlds. Homage to all of the Bodhisattvas in all worlds. Homage to the scripture of great wisdom.